In 2006, on the rainy outskirts of Seoul, a young woman ran barefoot through the dark streets of Sinjeongdong. She was missing a shoe, terrified, and fleeing an unseen pursuer. Reaching a desolate convenience store, she shoved coins into a public terminal. Emergency dispatchers heard heavy breathing, a desperate whisper, the sound of dragging chains, and finally, static. The call dropped before help arrived, leaving her entirely alone in the storm. When police investigate cases like this, they operate on a standard profile. They look for a lone predator, an individual outlier acting on their own violent impulses, completely detached from normal society. That was the angle Detective Kazuya Mori and investigative journalist Amy Sato tried to pursue. But as they dug through missing persons files, they stared at a growing pile of unsolved disappearances, all sharing the same eerie signatures, with no single suspect anywhere in sight. Focusing exclusively on finding a rogue individual allows law enforcement to ignore the broader environment that makes these crimes possible. Public pressure for a simple lone wolf narrative creates an institutional blind spot. Deep beneath the streets of Sinjeongdong, investigators uncovered an abandoned utility basement. Inside, they found rows of women's shoes, rusted restraints, and thousands of victim photographs covering the walls. This chart shows the true scale of the discovery. When forensic teams analyzed the dates labeled on a stash of audio cassettes found in the room, the timeline didn't cover a few months or years. These recordings mapped out an unbroken pattern of abductions spanning 3 decades. The tapes reveal a violent methodology that remained entirely static, while the city above ground underwent a total transformation. This level of unwavering consistency suggests the basement functioned as a site of inheritance, a place where a specific tradition of predation was preserved across generations, rather than the evolving habits of a single aging criminal. The perpetrator didn't need to outsmart the system. They operated perfectly within the historical blind spots the system had already created, using the city's forgotten spaces as permanent camouflage. Every single victim vanished under the exact same conditions, after midnight, during torrential downpours. The heavy rain cleared the streets of witnesses, while the blinding glare of neon on wet asphalt provided perfect visual cover. The targets were selected with cold precision. They were runaways, drifters, and women walking home alone, individuals whose sudden absence would take days or weeks for authorities to notice, if they noticed at all. To move unnoticed, the predator utilized the city's vast transit arteries. The sprawling, unmonitored tunnels and transfer stations of the subway system provided an intricate maze where a person could easily vanish below ground. The killer relied on the city's inherent structural isolation to hunt. The way modern urban design divides and segments the population became a primary tool for abduction, allowing victims to vanish into the gaps created by city planners. Beneath those modern subway lines lies an even older network, a labyrinth of forgotten Japanese wartime architecture and municipal utility tunnels long abandoned by city planners. Decades earlier, during periods of severe economic struggle and riots, the government sought to sanitize the public image of the streets. Their solution involved rounding up the homeless, runaways, and marginalized citizens, then forcing them into these underground shelters to keep them out of sight. When authorities eventually sealed the tunnel networks to quiet the unrest, they trapped people inside. One of the survivors was Naoki Shimura, a gentle, fragile-looking former caretaker who had been locked in the dark with the city's unwanted. Trapped underground, Naoki watched the people he was supposed to care for slowly starve to death. The trauma of hearing their cries echo through the concrete, completely ignored by the bustling world above, fractured his mind. Years later, Naoki hummed an old Japanese lullaby to the women he captured, a twisted attempt to ensure they wouldn't die feeling as lonely and discarded as the people he had watched perish decades ago. The government's decision to seal those tunnels essentially manufactured Naoki Shimura. By abandoning an entire population to the dark, the city's own institutional neglect created the monster that would eventually return to haunt its surface. When a massive rainstorm swept through Seoul, the dilapidated utility tunnels flooded completely. The torrential water washed away the thousands of photographs, the cassette tapes, and the physical proof of Naoki's horrors. Sensing an opportunity to bury their historical complicity for good, the government mobilized rescue crews to recover the surviving victims, then immediately poured concrete over the tunnel entrances, sealing the subterranean network permanently. A highly coordinated media strategy followed. Across every news channel, spokespeople repeated the exact same phrase, instructing the public that the disappearances were the tragic result of a lone, unstable criminal. Categorizing systemic failures as isolated incidents is in itself a deliberate act of institutional violence. It allows the government to protect its image while ensuring the underlying conditions remain unchanged. Kazuya and Emi were left to confront a system that cannot be repaired. Knowing that an arrest would only touch the surface of a deep-seated institutional failure effectively ended their faith in the work. Then, Emi received an anonymous package containing one last cassette tape. Through the static, a distorted voice whispered a warning, joined by a soft, familiar lullaby humming in the background. Naoki was gone, but someone else had already inherited the basement. Above ground, Seoul remains a triumph of urban engineering, a glittering grid of commerce and progress, where millions of people walk safely home under neon lights. Building a city that turns away from its most vulnerable inevitably constructs the very monsters that haunt its future. The threat remains as long as the architecture of neglect exists.